Good afternoon, good day, good morning to our colleagues in other parts of the world. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the webinar on the economics of biodiversity, the Dasgupta Review. Today's virtual event is hosted by the ASEAN Center for Biodiversity, or the ACB, in partnership with the Government of the United Kingdom. Today's event is part of the series of webinars on the economics of biodiversity supported by the European Union through the Biodiversity Conservation and Management of Protected Areas in ASEAN, or the BICOM project, by the German Development Bank, or KfW, through the Small Grants Program, and the GIZ through the Project on Institutional Strengthening of the Biodiversity Sector in the ASEAN. I am Clarissa Rida, Director for Program Development and Implementation, the ASEAN Center for Biodiversity. To ensure the best possible experience for everyone, whether joining us through Zoom or watching through Facebook Live, kindly take note of the following reminders. For our guests joining us through Zoom, kindly refer to the chat box found at the bottom of your screen for announcements and information from the organizers of today's event. We encourage you to post in the chat box your name, designation, and the organization that you are representing. Beside the chat box is the Q&A box where you can type in your questions for our speakers, which we will read out during the Q&A part of our event. For your questions, please include the name of the speaker you are addressing the question to. We will try to address as many questions as the time will allow. I would like to remind everyone that this event is being recorded for documentation purposes. For our friends watching through Facebook Live, please refer to the comment section for any announcement from our organizers. We encourage you to send in your messages and questions for the speakers or to the organizers using the comment section. Again, kindly include your name, designation, and the organization that you are representing along with your comment. For your questions, please specify the speaker that you are addressing the question to. Thank you very much. Now, to get us started on today's event, let us hear the opening message of the Executive Director of the ASEAN Center for Biodiversity, who was a panelist at the Channel News Asia's Leadership Summit held just last week. Let us welcome Dr. Teresa Mundita Lim. Dr. Lim, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Clarissa. His Excellency John Lam, Ambassador of the United Kingdom and Northern Ireland to the ASEAN. His Excellency Kong Fook, Deputy Secretary General of the ASEAN. Honorable Joey Sartis Salceda, Chairperson of the House of Representatives Committee on Ways and Means and Vice Chairperson Committee on Economic Affairs. Dr. Shelito Habito, former Secretary of the Socioeconomic Planning and Director General of the National Economic and Development Authority. My former boss, Mr. Demetrio L. Ignacio, now the Executive Vice President of Natural Resources Development Corporation, and a former chairperson of the ASEAN Senior Officials on the Environment. Esteemed panelists, participants, colleagues, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. It is an honor to welcome you all to the webinar series on the economics of biodiversity, the Dasgupta Review. I am pleased that we have gathered the region's highly esteemed economists and natural resources experts to enrich today's discussion. While ASEAN is one of the most biologically and culturally diverse regions, with 18% of the world's species on just 3% of the world's land area, it is projected to be one of the fastest growing economies in the world. The OECD's outlook projects that the ASEAN economy will grow by 4.9% from 2020 to 2024. On the other hand, Global Data, a leading data and analytics company, projects that with the receding daily COVID-19 cases, rollout of vaccines, increased spending by the governments, and easing of monetary restrictions will help revive ASEAN economies in 2021 with their real GDP forecasted to rise by 6%. But as the economy grows and expands rapidly, the demand for raw materials and ecosystem services increases. The natural resource capital of the region provides the necessary materials for the productive sectors such as agriculture, infrastructure, manufacturing, and processing. However, these economic activities also can put pressure on the region's environment as patterns for consumption and production changes over time. While there are also increasing efforts for efficient and sustainable consumption and production, the increasing demand for natural capital increases with rapid urbanization and industrialization. Recognizing that the region's rich biodiversity and natural resources underpins ASEAN's economic growth and prosperity, efforts to integrate natural capital in the accounting practices in the national statistical systems go way back to the early 1990s. The most recent efforts include the World Bank's initiatives on wealth accounting and valuation of ecosystem services, which covered Indonesia and the Philippines. There are also efforts to integrate natural capital in the business processes of the private sector. Since the early 1990s, there have been numerous efforts to promote the proper accounting of biodiversity. The most recent regional level activity is the assessment of natural capital policy and practice in ASEAN public and private sectors, entitled Investing in Sustainable Natural Capital in the ASEAN. The assessment provided recommendations for an ASEAN Natural Capital Roadmap, which included actions for the ASEAN member states. In paving a pathway towards building back better, the ASEAN has recently adopted the ASEAN Comprehensive Recovery Framework, or the ACRF, which highlights nature-based solutions to increase the region's resilience against future pandemics and support long-term economic recovery. The whole of community approach emphasized by the framework calls for a rethinking of supply and value chains, ensuring the balance between resilience, sustainability, and efficiency in production while protecting the region's rich natural capital. And these tasks cannot be done by a single sector alone. For these recommendations to be put in action, we need the active participation of all of sectors of society. Taking guidance from the direction set by the ASEAN leaders through the ACRF, and with mainstreaming as one of our main thrusts, the ASEAN Center for Biodiversity, together with the ASEAN member states, is committed in its efforts to ensure cross-sectoral collaboration and multi-stakeholder engagement through facilitating discussions and actions towards a greener pathway to recovery for the region. The independent global report, Economics of Biodiversity, the Dasgupta Review, presents steering assessments that provide solid basis for biodiversity mainstreaming across sectors. As we discuss the Dasgupta Review, we can try to identify relevant actions from its recommendations that we can carry forward. I hope that this webinar will serve as a platform to reach out and engage the business sectors, economists, and government agencies in changing our definition of economic wealth and placing nature at the center of our actions. In closing, let me emphasize that integrating natural capital is crucial to doing business responsibly, both in the government and the private sectors, especially as we move beyond business as usual towards a better normal. The evidence is clear. We can only achieve sustainable economic growth by taking care of our natural capital, our biodiversity, on which our economy and our lives depend. I hope that today's discussion will enable us together to craft a better pathway, not just for biodiversity protection, but also for economic sustainability. We are joined by experts from around the globe and the ASEAN to explore actions, priorities, and build a good case for investing in nature and biodiversity-related actions. Have a good day, everyone. Lisa, you're muted.
So I think I missed my intro, I think, but I see my face up there. So I think it probably means
Thank you, Dr. Lee. Yeah. Today we are joined by the first dedicated UK ambassador to ASEAN. He opened the UK mission to ASEAN at the time of his appointment. Ladies and gentlemen, may I present the Ambassador of United Kingdom to ASEAN, His Excellency John Lam.
Many thanks for that introduction. And Dr. Teresa Lin, His Excellency DSG Kung Fo, distinguished panelists, ladies and gentlemen, it's a real pleasure to be with you today, to be back here with the ASEAN Centre for Biodiversity, and even greater pleasure to be talking about such an important subject. So thank you again for inviting me. I thought, if I may, I would say a few words about why in the UK we think 2021 is such an important year for this set of issues, both because of the COP26 climate change conference and, of course, the biodiversity conference that's happening in China this year too. I thought I might then say a bit about the situation in Southeast Asia and why this region matters so much. Dr. Teresa has, of course, already set some of that out. And then I'd say a few words about the Dasgupta review and what the UK is doing as a result. So first of all, I would just flag that for the UK, we see biodiversity and nature-based solutions as really integral to the work that we're doing ahead of COP26, which we'll be hosting at the end of this year. Natural systems are on the front line in the fight against climate change, and the linkages between the two are really strong. So of course, our natural environments can suffer and can be degraded as a result of climate change. At the same time, if we protect and preserve our natural environments, they can help us adapt to rising temperatures, they can help to lock in and store carbon, and hopefully to avoid the worst impacts that we're worried about. So as I said, that means ahead of COP26, the UK is engaging with partners around the world on some of the key things that we can do to protect nature. So that includes increasing public and private financial flows to protect and restore nature. It includes championing marine ecosystems such as coral and mangroves and protecting the world's oceans more broadly. And it's also about building on the just rural transition towards resilient, productive agriculture that can protect jobs and create new jobs while also protecting our natural environment. Now, of course, all of that is part of us hoping to reach the goals of the Paris Agreement to reduce the growth in global temperatures, but also to adapt successfully to the impacts of climate change, restoring and protecting and enhancing nature as we go. Now, for some of that, as I said, it's a real kind of co-benefit, because as we all know, unfortunately, some of the impacts of climate change are already upon us, and natural systems can help to protect us all. So we're working with governments, with business and communities worldwide on all of that. And we're really, really pleased to be working with ASEAN under our COP26 climate change framework, and also with the ASEAN Centre for Biodiversity on these issues. Now, as I said, Southeast Asia is a really, really critical region for all of these things. It's home, as Dr. Teresa was just saying, to a huge amount of the world's biodiversity, nearly 15% of the world's tropical rainforests, and at least 4 of the top 25 globally important biodiversity hotspots. But all of these things are also under some pressure. Unfortunately, habitat loss in Southeast Asia is a real thing. That includes, loss of mangroves in some of the key coastal countries, including Vietnam and Thailand. It includes rainforest loss in Philippines, in Borneo, in Indonesia. It includes, emblematic species of the region, Asian elephants or Komodo dragons, who are becoming threatened or endangered because of these things. At the same time, there's huge amounts of opportunity here. So by protecting the forests, as well as all the real benefits we see for the climate and for nature, there's real financial benefits as well. There are estimates that ASEAN could benefit from almost $30 billion of financial flows from the carbon markets in the form of carbon credits if its forests are protected. There's huge benefits to coastal communities if we protect the mangroves, protection against storms, ensuring that we have healthy fish for fishermen, all these kinds of things. And of course, the marine habitat in this region is is so biodiverse and so important. And there are real opportunities for things like blue carbon programs as well. Now, I want to say a little bit about the UK. Of course, we're here today primarily to talk about the Dasgupta review, which is an independent global review that was commissioned by the UK government. And what we wanted to do, it was led by Professor Sir Partha Dasgupta. It looks at a kind of new and comprehensive economic framework that really takes account of humans' dependency on nature. And I think I would say from a UK government point of view, this kind of approach is really important for us because we all recognize that economic growth matters. All of our populations want to see their living standards continue to rise. But at the same time, you know, as I've already mentioned, protecting nature carries real economic benefits and losing biodiversity carries real economic costs. So what we want to do with this kind of thinking is to really pull out some of these costs and benefits to really be able to make hard-headed decisions. Now, in the UK, we're already doing some of that. We're committing to protect at least 30% of our land and ocean by 2030. We're investing at least $3 billion over 5 years towards climate change solutions that protect nature and biodiversity. We're promoting sustainable agriculture. And the $3 billion that I mentioned is part of our $11.6 billion commitment of international climate finance. And we're going to be using that to help protect biodiversity-rich land and oceans, shift to sustainable food production and supply, and support the livelihoods of the world's poorest in a way that protects nature as well. So as I said, we're really pleased to be here today, really pleased to be working with the ASEAN Centre for Biodiversity and the ASEAN Secretariat. I'm really looking forward as well to an event that we'll be doing on the 8th of June, which is the ASEAN UK COP26 event on nature and biodiversity happening on World Oceans Day. So I'm really looking forward to today's discussion and I'm hoping to see many of you on the 8th of June again. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, His Excellency Chan Lam. Our final message for the opening program of this webinar will be given by the former Undersecretary of State at the Office of the Council of Ministers of the Royal Government of Cambodia and the co-founder of the Cambodian Institute for Strategic Studies. It is a privilege to have with us today no less than the Deputy Secretary General of the ASEAN Sociocultural Community, His Excellency Kong Pok. DSG, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Clarissa, for your kind introductions. Excellencies John Lam, UK Ambassador to ASEAN, Dr. Teresa Mundita, Executive Director of the ASEAN Center for Biodiversity, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, a very good afternoon. It is my pleasure to be invited to give a short welcome remark at the ASEAN Center for Biodiversity webinar on the economic of biodiversity, the Dasgupta review. I would like to thank and recognize ACB for organizing this very timely and important discussion on the economics of biodiversities. I would also like to commend the support of the government of the United Kingdom in partnering with ACB to organize this webinar. At the same time, my appreciation also goes to our partner from the EU and Germany, especially through the ASEAN EU Biodiversity Conservation and Management of Protected Areas in ASEAN BCAM project, the small grant program of the German Development Bank, and the Institutional Strengthening of Biodiversity Sector in ASEAN, or ISB project of GIZ, for making this webinar possible. Ladies and gentlemen, we are delighted this afternoon to have with us Professor Partha Dasgupta and his colleague to present and discuss the key findings of the Dasgupta review on the economic of biodiversities. Indeed, the value of our rich flora and fauna and its contribution to our region growth and development cannot be overemphasized. The ASEAN region is known to host some of the world's most mega diverse ecosystems. However, the region also faces serious threat to its rich biodiversity, with an estimated 70 to 90% of habitats and 13 to 42% of species at risk within this century. As such, it is imperative for all sectors in the region to work together to continue to protect nature by investing more in natural capitals and values to ensure green ASEAN and sustainable future for everyone. We commend Professor Dasgupta and his team for providing us good evidence on why we need stronger cooperations and sustained investment in nature and biodiversity conservation. A country asset do not only include physical capital or the access to infrastructure and production inputs, as well as human capital. One important consideration we have to take note is natural capital and access to key ecosystem services. A key principle advocated by sustainable development in the ethical and wise utilization of natural resources. This covers the efficient use of resources within the nature carrying capacities, the preservation of biodiversities, and the reduction of waste and energy generation. The COVID-19 pandemic has highlighted the importance of biodiversity conservation. Experts warn that continued biodiversity loss and other human-induced environmental activity, such as illegal wildlife trade and deforestation, bring us closer in contact with zoonotic diseases and pathogens. Similarly, the growing impact of climate change and natural disaster, especially to ASEAN member states, cannot be understated. This is a strong evidences on why we need to adopt and integrate nature-based solution into our policies and programs. Our society health and well-being relies heavily on Mother Nature condition. Investing into a greener planet means investing into our society future. In ASEAN, we strongly support initiatives that puts premium on the region-rich biodiversity and natural capital. We also support calls for strengthened efforts to further promote nature-based solutions and addressing some of the emerging development issues we face as a region. The ASEAN Comprehensive Recovery Framework, or the ACRF, adopted at the 37th ASEAN Summit in November 2020, highlighted the need to put a spotlight on preserving the region's natural capital as we recover and overcome the challenges brought by the ongoing global health crisis. Our future action must focus further on promoting greener investment and more socially responsible practices. We simply cannot return to the business as usual. In recent years, ASEAN has also worked on this initiative, strengthening regional and local capacities and natural capital reporting and integration. Through the enhanced regional EU-ASEAN Dialogue Instrument of ERIDI, ASEAN worked closely with EU counterpart developing the ASEAN Natural Status Report, investing in sustainable natural capital in ASEAN. Launched in November 2019, this preliminary study provides an overview on challenges and opportunity in the region's natural capital policies and practices. The finding of this study serves as a basis in developing an ASEAN Natural Capital Roadmap, which hopes to further enhance collaboration among different sectors in integrating natural capital valuation to regional and national programs and policies. Moving forward, ASEAN is now working on ASEAN Joint Statement on Biodiversities with the support of the ACB for the upcoming 15th Conference of the Parties to the Convention on Biological Diversity, or CBD COP15, to be held in Kunming, China in October 2021. This joint statement hopes to capture the aspiration and goals of the region to collectively work together in promoting biodiversity conservation and responding to the emerging challenges and opportunity arising globally, regionally, and locally, particularly in response to the post-2019 Global Biodiversity Framework and our ASEAN Comprehensive Recovery Framework. Among these key issues are building adaptive capacities to the impact of climate change, natural disaster, combating illegal wildlife trade, and preventing the rise of future pandemics. Ladies and gentlemen, to this end, I strongly encourage the ASEAN Center for Biodiversity and our partner to look closely into the findings and recommendation of the Dasgupta review on the economics of biodiversity. It will be useful to look into how this important information can be further enriched and applied to the ASEAN context. We at ASEAN welcome strengthening our partnership and collaboration with our partners to examine how we can specifically make use of this timely review and help us work toward developing the ASEAN Natural Capital Roadmap, highlighting the importance on promoting regional expertise and enhancing local capacities. Once again, I wish to recognize the effort of Professor Dasgupta and his team, as well as the support of the government of the UK, and the ASEAN Center for Biodiversity for gathering us this afternoon for this very important discussion. I wish everyone a productive and fruitful discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, DSG Kong Kwok. Now, please allow me to introduce to you the moderator of our main segment for this webinar. Our moderator for today's event is the former Secretary of Socioeconomic Planning of the Philippines. He is currently the chairman of Brain Trust, Knowledge and Options for Sustainable Development Incorporated, a think tank and consultancy firm focused on policy research, advice, and training on sustainable development. He is also a professor at the Department of Economics of the Ateneo de Manila University in the Philippines. Actually, for participants from the Philippines, you might be most familiar with him for his weekly column called No Free Lunch, which is published by the Philippine Daily Inquirer. Please welcome Dr. Shelito Habito. Dr. Shell, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Risa, for that very kind introduction. Please allow me to welcome you all again to our event today, the Economics of Biodiversity, the Dasgupta Review. It's a pleasure and honor for me to be part of this event, which will give us an in-depth discussion of the Dasgupta Review, covering its key messages and recommended actions for the countries, especially here in the ASEAN, and including its implications. ASEAN member states stand to benefit immensely from this discussion this afternoon. Now, to give a brief background, this newly released review is a detailed global report that examined the history of our relationship with nature. The review identifies three broad transitions towards sustainable pathways, which are, well, first, addressing the excessive demand for goods and services that have strained nature's capacity to supply. Second, changing measures of economic success and including nature's assets in the definition of wealth. And third, institutional transformation in the finance and education systems. And who better to start off the discussion on the Dasgupta Review than the lead author himself? May I present Emeritus Professor Frank Ramsey, Professor Emeritus of Economics from the University of Cambridge, Professor Sir Partha Dasgupta, who has kindly sent in his recorded message.
It's not just our economies, but it's all our entire life is built around nature because we are part of nature. We're not external to it. Nature provides us with clean water. It offers pollination services, which enable us to grow food. It circulates air, water. I can't think of anything that we do which is not founded on nature's processes. So if we jeopardize that, it's not just our economies that are in trouble. Our lives are in trouble. The demands we make of the goods and services that nature provides us exceeds its ability to supply them on a sustainable basis. We have had a good life. The last 70 years have been particularly favorable to the generation which has lived through this period. We have never had it so good. We live far longer than we ever did before. There are more of us. We're better educated. We're better fed. We travel a lot more. The flip side of it is that we've been living beyond our means, if you want to use a very standard imagery. And by our means, I mean that we are degrading the biosphere in order to do that. And so we've been living a terrifically buoyant life over the past 70 years by making the biosphere less habitable, less productive for our descendants. Ecosystems are assets, just as our road network is an asset, just as our educational system is an asset. So in talking about our relationship with nature, we're really talking about an asset management problem, balancing the various types of assets in our portfolio. and we are mismanaging that. The reason our financial systems do not take nature seriously in their calculations is because the information on the basis of which decisions are made does not contain much about nature. For example, we use GDP, gross domestic product, as a measure of the success of the community or society or a country. And yet the measure has nothing to say about what we are doing to nature. So the lens with which our institutions see their societies is one which doesn't notice nature. So keeping nature out of the formal models, the quantitative models that drive policy, has meant that we are able to imagine unlimited growth possibilities in our material standard of living. That carries with it the thought that humanity is external to nature, whereas we are, of course, embedded in it. And since nature is bounded, it's finite, it must be that the picture of unlimited growth possibilities is wholly flawed. I think COVID-19 does present an opportunity for redirecting the nature of investment. We need to think big for two reasons. One is that greening our investment portfolio brings with it employment opportunities. And secondly, green projects are complementary to one another. Each on its own, $1 million here or $1 million there on its own, is not anywhere as productive as a bulk investment in green projects. So these two features, employment opportunities and productivity gains by spending large chunks on green projects, together offer a real low-hanging fruit, as they say. And I think we citizens ought to insist on governments thinking big in terms of channeling their investment. Not the odd $1 million here or $1 million there, but a solid hunk of investment in various parts, in fixing various parts of the biosphere and nurturing it.
Is that it? Okay. Well, thank you, Professor Dasgupta. It's quite significant that a very prominent economist, and I remember, I must say that Professor Dasgupta was already part of the literature when I was in my graduate studies, and I will not say how long ago, but Professor Dasgupta must have been a young rising star at that time. But anyway, it's quite important that somebody as prominent as he is now a champion for this more complete assessment of our economy and of our natural environment. Now, our next two speakers both hold key positions in the Dasgupta Review. First, we have Ms. Emily Mackenzie, the head of evidence and policy for the economics of biodiversity, independent review team at Her Majesty's Treasury. And prior to joining the UK government, she worked as chief advisor for economics and sustainability in the World Wildlife Fund's Global Science team. Also with us is Mr. Ant Parham, the head of strategy, stakeholder engagement, and secretariat unit of the Dasgupta Review. As part of Her Majesty's Treasury, he worked on a range of international facing economic and policy issues, finance policy issues, including the European Union's budget negotiations, successive UK-China economic and financial dialogues, and leading on to G20 and G7 finance track policy. So I'd like to present to you now Ms. Emily Mackenzie and Mr. Ant Parham.
Thank you very much. I think we've got some slides which your colleagues will share on our behalf, which is very helpful. Great, thank you. I think I can see them coming up. So I wanted to start by thanking the ASEAN Centre for Biodiversity for hosting us today. My name is Ant Parham. I'm joined by Emily Mackenzie, and together we form part of a team based in the Treasury in London, tasked with supporting Professor Dasgupta to deliver his global independent review on the economics of biodiversity. And although we won't be able to do so as eloquently as Professor Dasgupta, we're going to spend the next 15 minutes or so explaining the review's key conclusions, expanding on Professor Dasgupta's remarks just now. We're really looking forward to hearing the perspectives of our panel members later, and hopefully those of the audience too. I should preface what follows by saying that as an independent review, this doesn't represent the view of the UK government, which is expected to formally respond to the review in due course. So if we could go to the next slide, please. So for the first time in 65 million years, the number of plant and animal species worldwide is in sustained mass decline. And there's no escaping the fact that we're collectively damaging nature at a really alarming rate, with biodiversity declining faster than at any time in human history. But the economic consequences of biodiversity are often misunderstood or overlooked, which is why in spring 2019, the UK Treasury commissioned a global independent review on the economics of biodiversity led by Professor Siddhartha Dasgupta. The review provides a comprehensive framework for thinking about biodiversity, grounded in a really deep understanding of how ecosystem processes are affected by economic activity. And in short, the review concludes that ultimately a really fundamental change in how we think about and approach economics is urgently needed if we're going to reverse biodiversity loss and protect and enhance our prosperity now and for future generations. Next slide, please. So at its core, the review sees biodiversity loss as an asset management problem, which Professor Dasgupta referred to. So nature is an asset, just as produced capital like roads and machinery, or human capital like education and health. Natural assets produce a flow of goods and services over time. And we rely on nature to provide us with food, water, shelter, to regulate our climate and control disease, maintain nutrient cycles, and also to provide us with spiritual fulfillment, among many other examples. And biodiversity is the diversity within those natural assets. So more diverse ecosystems are more productive, more resilient, and more able to adapt to change. And just as diversity within a financial portfolio reduces risk and uncertainty, greater biodiversity reduces risk and uncertainty within a portfolio of natural assets. So thinking of nature as an asset means realizing really that we're all asset managers. So individuals, businesses, governments, and international organizations, we all manage assets through our spending and investment decisions, whether that's consciously or unconsciously. Next slide, please. But the problem is that collectively we fail to manage our global portfolio of assets well. So global capital accounts, which are displayed on this chart, shine a light on the extent of that mismanagement. So the chart shows estimates by the UN Environment Programme of global per capita accounting values of the three classes of capital goods since the early 1990s. And it shows that globally produced capital per head doubled and human capital per head increased by about 13%, while at the same time the value of the stock of natural capital per head declined by nearly 40%. Next slide, please. So taking a step back, while humanity has prospered at an unprecedented rate since the middle of the 20th century, the ways in which humanity has achieved that prosperity has come at a real expense of nature. So between 1970 and 2016, for example, the population of species of mammals, birds, fish, reptiles, and amphibians fell by 68% on average globally. So if we go to the next slide, and I'll hand over to Emily to walk you through the rest of the key insights from the review.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much also from me to the ASEAN Centre of Biodiversity for welcoming us today to talk about the Dasgupta review. So yeah, I will give a bit more detail on the Dasgupta review's overall conceptual framework and its recommendations. So the review shows how this environmental degradation that Ant just showed you the data for globally is due to what we think of in the review as a demand-supply imbalance. The central part of the review's framework that talks about this we call the impact inequality, which you can see that the maths for in the center of the planet picture on this slide. So this impact inequality represents that our demands, human demands on nature for its various services have for some time now outstripped its ability to supply those services on a sustainable basis. So the left-hand side of this inequality represents our demands globally. This is sometimes called our ecological footprint. So our demands on nature are determined by three factors globally: the size and composition of our individual demands on the biosphere, that's little y, so our economic activity, how much we're extracting from nature and the waste we're putting back in. The size of the human population making those demands, that's capital N. And then the efficiency with which we are converting nature's services to meet our demands and to return our waste back to nature, that's alpha. The right-hand side represents nature's supply, and that's a function of the overall stock of nature, our natural assets, S, and the biosphere's regenerative rate, its ability to regenerate, G. And another organization has brought this idea to life. The Global Footprint Network has estimated that the equivalent of 1.6 Earths would be needed to meet humanity's aggregate demands on a sustainable basis. And clearly we do not have 1.6 Earths. So sustainability requires us to bring back this ratio down to 1. And as context, the ratio was 0.9 globally in the late 1960s, so some time ago. So this part of the review's conceptual framework, the impact inequality, is very important because it provides what the review sees as a condition for truly sustainable development, to bring our demands back on nature back in line with supply, so turning this inequality into an equality, and to increase nature's supply above what it is currently. And it's also fundamental to the review's recommendations. So when I get at the end to our recommendations, you can think back to this equation because it decomposes the different elements of both demand and supply, which can be changed to achieve sustainability in our engagements with nature. So next slide, please. So the review argues that this persistent imbalance, this demand overshoot, is endangering the prosperity of both current and future generations. We're running down our natural assets, as Ant showed, the assets on which we rely, and biodiversity loss is undermining the productivity and resilience and ability of those assets to adapt to change. And the review shows how this is fueling significant risk and uncertainty for our economies and our well-being. So this is based first and foremost on an understanding from earth sciences and ecology that ecosystem processes are what we call in the review non-linear. So to explain that a bit, in other words, if you were to break an ecosystem into smaller parts, the sum of their components would not be equal to the previous whole. And that's what Professor Dasgupta was referring to when he talked about the reason for thinking big when we think of the need to invest in nature. So related to this, the review explores the science of ecosystem tipping points and regime shifts. So ecosystems can shift from biodiverse systems to poorer, less productive systems. And one of many powerful examples of this is if the Amazon over in another region of the world were to tip from rainforest to savanna, it would have huge consequences for the water cycle globally. And I'm sure there are many more examples in the ASEAN region. So these changes can be rapid, they can be hard to predict, they can have far-reaching consequences. And the reviewer explores the significance of the fact that these changes are very hard to reverse. In some cases, they're impossible to recover from. And so it argues that on this basis, conservation is preferable to restoration, all else equal, because it allows us to keep our options open. Next slide, please. So a reason for urgency, given this situation, is the need to maintain our options for the future, also known by economists often as option value. So the natural world and the species within it have already provided us with a huge range of materials and compounds and pharmaceuticals, and there are many more undiscovered. Maybe they estimate maybe as many as 90% of species in the ocean are yet to be discovered. And many of these species we could hold solutions, further solutions to unknown future problems as well as current problems. And we know that extinction is irreversible. Once lost, a species is lost forever, along with all the potential options it holds. So we see value in keeping our options open. Next slide, please. So analysis in the review shows that just to maintain current levels of biodiversity would require significant action now. Vivid Economics and the Natural History Museum here in the UK assessed the expected costs of incentives for land use change required to stem terrestrial biodiversity loss. And they estimated that delaying action by just a decade would more than double the social cost of preventing further species loss by 2050. These costs rise from around $7 trillion if we act today to around $15 if we delay. And even more worrying, by delaying action by just 10 years, it looks like the scale of land use change required becomes so large, it would be infeasible to achieve. Next slide, please. So what's underlying this problem? We've shown you what the problem is, framings around an asset management issue. Why is it happening? So the review highlights three features of nature that are at the heart of this problem. First, nature is mobile. And Professor Dasgupta speaks very poetically about this, how fishes swim and winds blow. Nature's always on the move. And further, much of nature is also silent and invisible, notably the vast biodiversity in the soils beneath our feet. And in the review, we emphasize that these characteristics, that nature is mobile, silent, and invisible, make it difficult or impossible to account for our use of nature and its services and the impacts we have on them. And this leads to what economists call pervasive externalities. So nature is mostly open to all at no monetary charge. Its true worth to society, the true value of all these various services that Ant mentioned and Professor Dasgupta referred to, they're not reflected in our market prices. And these pricing distortions are leading us in part to invest relatively more in those produced capital and underinvest in our natural assets, the data that Ant showed you. But the review goes beyond this. So it sets out that humanity's unsustainable engagement with nature is not simply market failure, it reflects institutional failure writ large. So to bring this to life, our institutions have not successfully managed this situation, these externalities. Two examples, governments throughout the world have exacerbated the pricing problem by paying people to exploit rather than protect nature in many instances. And also we lack many of the institutional arrangements we need to protect global public goods, such as the open ocean or the world's rainforests. I'll just flag one final thing here is that the review defines institutions broadly, as you can see on the slide, and it highlights in particular, and this is drawing on work in the ASEAN, included in the ASEAN region, the role of community-based institutions for enabling sustainable engagement with nature, in particular the roles of civil society and communities. So we draw on case studies from around the world, but including in Southeast Asia, that looks at the effectiveness of these community-based institutions, but also explores their fragility and what can cause them to fall apart. So next slide, please. The final on our framework before I quickly run through our recommendations. So the review starts from understanding and accepting a simple truth, which Professor Dasgupta spoke about at the beginning of his opening remarks, that the global economy is embedded within nature, within the biosphere. So this view contrasts with standard models of economic development and growth, which view humanity as external to nature. So standard models view humanity as sort of dipping into the biosphere for its goods and services, returning waste back to nature. And in that, it's sort of assumed that we're able to leave and we're unaffected by the consequences. In contrast to this, the review argues, well, the review argues we cannot leave. The biosphere is our home. Conceptualizing the economy as external to the biosphere, it sees as encouraging this view that human ingenuity and technology can raise global output indefinitely. But in reality, this risks affecting the biosphere so adversely it could be tipped out of stability regimes. So we take quite a different view in the review, accepting that our economy is embedded within nature, raises that because the biosphere is bounded, the global economy is bounded. And so in doing this, it reshapes our understanding of sustainable economic development and growth. So I'll now move to conclude. Next slide, please, just to give you a brief overview of the review's recommendations, and perhaps in the discussion we can get more into the details of these. So overall, the review argues, and our moderator spoke about this, that sustainable economic growth and development requires us to take a different path, where our engagements with nature are not only sustainable, but also enhance our collective wealth and well-being, and that of our descendants. So these three broad and interconnected transitions are the first to shift from impact inequality to equality. That means increasing nature's supply relative to its current level and reducing our demands on nature. And second, to change our measures of economic success in order to guide us and keep us on a sustainable path. And finally, to transform our institutions and systems to enable that change. So in the next slide, I will just give a few examples of this, just to bring it alive. So here you can see in the diagram, these are examples that fit within each of these three transitions. So first, if you could click through just to highlight the first grouping, these are actions to ensure that we balance the impact inequality and increase nature's supply to a healthy state. So this includes things on nature's supply side, things that will be very familiar to many of you, investing in the restoration and conservation of our natural assets, improving the management of the land and sea to benefit both nature and people, such as through sustainable fishing and agriculture practices, and also managing the demographic transition, so humanity's absolute demands, through better access to community-based family planning and reproductive health. And also actions on the demand side of this equation, so shifting to more sustainable patterns of consumption and production, and accounting for how supply chains impact and depend on nature along the entire supply chain. And finally, looking at how to improve our efficiency, so investing in technologies that improve the efficiency both of how we extract things from nature and reduce our waste and its impact on ecosystems. So if you click through, the next grouping of recommendations highlight measures of success. So while standard economic measures, and Professor Dasgupta referred to this, such as GDP, are indispensable in short-run macroeconomic analysis, they significantly mislead us when looking at social well-being across the generations. They don't consider nature. The review argues that governments should move towards an inclusive measure of wealth. So that's the sum of the true values to society of produced and human and natural capital as this primary measure. And in order to move this, and I know many countries in the ASEAN region are already making progress with this, there needs to be an increase in the spread and depth of natural capital accounting. And finally, we need to improve our productivity measures, so ensuring they account for nature. So current productivity measures that are based on those standard models are often misleading because they're based only on produced and human capital. And consequently, an increasing rate of environmental degradation can be misinterpreted as a good thing, an increase in knowledge or institutional improvements. So the final bucket, if you just click to this is the final bucket of our recommendations, is around institutions and systems to enable this sustainable engagement with nature. So we're looking at having polycentric institutions that involve all levels of society, from local to global, that allow us to share information and coordinate at all levels to have really strong rules of engagement. And then we highlight in particular two systems that need reform. First, ensuring on finance, ensuring that our global financial system is supporting nature. So this is having both public and private finance with a critical role to play, reorienting financial flows and better management of nature-related financial risks. And finally, the review concludes that empowering citizens to make informed choices is really key. Professor Dasgupta shows that relying on institutions will not be enough because it will never be possible to observe and verify whether everyone is following the rules, even if we set them. And so it concludes with an importance on the importance of education and recommending reform to education systems, including how we teach economics to reflect the role of nature. So embedding natural environment across educational policy from the earliest years right the way through to universities and higher education. So in the final minute, I'll hand back to Ant, who's just going to show on the next slide our key messages to conclude.
Thanks, Emily. So very briefly to leave you with the review's key messages. So we're seriously mismanaging our most precious asset, nature, and our demands are far exceeding its capacity to supply. Economic and finance decision-making needs to reflect that humanity and the global economy are embedded within, not external to nature. And to engage sustainably with nature, we need to change how we think, how we act, and how we measure success. And the review proposes those three broad and interconnected transitions to do so, which Emily outlined. We need to invest in nature's supply and address our demand overshoot. We need to move towards a measure of inclusive wealth as our main measure of sustainable economic prosperity. And we need to transform our institutions to allow this change to happen and sustain it for the long run. So we'll stop there. And as I said before, we're really looking forward to hearing the panelists' reflections and the views of the audience too. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ms. Mackenzie and Mr. Parham. Very enlightening. In fact, I think what we are all seeing is really a change of mindsets. Is very important, especially for us economists who tend to be looking with somewhat blinders even sometimes in the way that we look at our world. Well, let me just first reiterate that if our participants have any questions for our speakers, which we'll give way to later on, we will ask you to kindly use the Q&A box in Zoom. You just click that Q&A icon on the bottom right, or you can use the comment section as well if you are happening to tune in via Facebook. So Q&A for Zoom and the comment section in Facebook. Please do include your name and organization and the speaker you're addressing the question to if you are focused on a particular speaker. So later on, we will strive to address all of the questions during the Q&A portion. At this point, though, we would like to call on some distinguished personalities to share some views and insights and to share their own experiences, perhaps, on ongoing initiatives related to the findings of the Dasgupta review. So we have invited some experts, including some key government agencies, to react to and provide us their own insights in this portion. So our first discussant is the Director of the Economy and Environment Partnership in Southeast Asia, or EPSI, which is a regional platform for transdisciplinary research to address global environmental challenges. For this, let us welcome Dr. Pham Can Nam. Dr. Nam, you have the floor.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. Thank ASEAN Center for Biodiversity for inviting me as a panelist in this webinar series and giving me an opportunity to read the Dasgupta review. And you know, the review's framing of the problem from the point of view of the nature as an asset, and we are citizen investor, and we are asset manager is a very powerful to me. That's a change the view. Let me share my screen to start with my discussion on the review. Yes. Can you see my slides?
Yes, we can.
Sorry, yeah. Let me start with our region, Southeast Asia region. You know, we all have a very complex geological history. Like a million years ago, there were many collisions of many tectonic place. So that make the sea level fluctuating many times in the region, and it created the different mainland and archipelagos in the region, and blurs with the tropical climates that lead to the region with a very very rich biodiversity, very high species richness and endemism. So it leads to a very ecosystem productivity, very high ecosystem productivities. And and we are in the Southeast Asia region. We have also a very complex socio-economic context. Very many countries in our region experience a rapid economic growth with high population growth too, and we owe a divergent political system. So the question is, so how to manage our assets, natural assets, for sustainable development? So that is the key question from the Dasgupta review. It is an example of how high biodiversity we endow with. For mangrove, we are at the world's largest and best developed mangrove. You see in the map here with the yellow and the red color concentrating in the Southeast Asia. And for coral reef too, we and Australian owe the highest level of marine biodiversity related to coral reef. And let me go directly to the discussion of the reviews. I construct my discussion surrounding three key messages from the review. The review makes very clear that the urgent and transformative action taken now would be very significantly less costly than delay, and that requires change on very three broad fronts. The first one is the demand and the supply, as as you just heard about the authors of the reviews. And in my table here, I summarize the three main recommendations for the first policy option, that is the demand and supply. And I summarize the current situation, what research has been going on, and what policy that our Southeast Asia nation is adopting, and I also discuss the some research gap and some potential policy for the future, for the near future. So for the first one, the first recommendation regarding the demand and supply of the nature access is that we should change the food production system by investing in the technological innovation and implement sustainable management. And for the research, I found that in Southeast Asia, our current research mostly focus on economic analysis of land use. We also many research looking at the demand for energy, because the demand for energy lead to climate change and indirectly affect to biodiversity. We also have many research on technology adoption and impact evaluation of system changes. So that research provide the evidence for the policy, and currently we observe in the region that several countries use different investment incentives to promote high-tech farming. That is energy safe and use the inputs efficiently. For the future, the near future, I think our research should focus more on the resilience of the production system, that the current research is lacking of, and for policy we might think about a shift from a traditional farming system currently widely used in the region now to high tech but ecological based farming system. For the second policy recommendation from the review, that is restructure of consumption and production patterns. And you know, for research, we have many research on the use of economic instrument for environmental and resources management, and we also conducted many research on production impacts of policy intervention, several research on green consumption behavior. And regarding to the policy currently, several countries in the region showing the increasing concern, and several countries like Vietnam, they have already tested the green economy model, and they are now promoting the circular economy models written in the new law of Vietnam too. So that is the new development of the policy regarding restructuring the consumption and production, and you know, for the future of research, I agree with Sir Dasgupta in the review that we need to use behavioral nudge, behavioral science to understand the use and the effectiveness, the use of the consumption, input in production, output of production, and also, you know, we need to we are an economists. We need to apply the dynamic ecological economic modeling as shown in the review, and more importantly, and it's a very new to us economists. Many of us is classical, neoclassical economists, that we need to learn how to incorporate the ecosystem tipping points and the irreversibility of the ecosystem processes into our economic models. So for the policy, I'm thinking a very general, very broad policy for fair and sustainable consumption, production, and supply chains as shown in the review. For the third policy is the invest in natural assets, and you know, currently in the region we are conducting quite a lot of research on like cost benefits of the protected areas, or we apply risks and uncertainty estimation factors in our models to evaluate the economic of different management system, and for policy application in the region, we are observing governments applied use many reforestation program, that is an investment in natural assets, or the establishment of protected areas, natural reserve, nature reserve, and national park widely in the region. That is the investment, a very good investment in natural assets. For the future research, here we, as shown in the review, we need to incorporate the dynamic and non-linearity in ecosystem services in our assessment, our model, and we also need to look at the economic analysis of the nature-based solution. That is our investment in natural assets. For the policy, I took from the review that the payment for ecosystem services or the nature-based solution is our expected policy for the investment in natural assets. For the second broad policy recommendation, that is the measurement of the economic success. The first thing we need to estimate the value of natural assets. Here, regarding to research in the region, we have very rich literatures on the values of different ecosystem services of different ecosystem in the region using stated preferences, review preferences, and market price. One example is TIP for Southeast Asia. And
Dr. Pham, can I just ask you to please wrap up soon?
Sorry. Sorry. And then for valuation here in regarding the research, we need to incorporate the behavioral insights and socially embedded preference. Similarly, for the incorporating the natural capital into national accounting system in the region, we currently have Indonesia and Philippines leading the ways of the World Bank, and Laos, Myanmar, Vietnam is now participating. In the future, we need to see the more coverage of this one in the region. My last slide for the last recommendation, transform the institution and system. For the research for this one. The first one is the establish the supranational institutional arrangement. For the research, we have several research on public good game and common pool research game for the understanding the contribution and sharing system. In the future, we need to upgrade that game for the macro issues to lead to the mechanism developed by the regional governments. For the transform the financial system in the region now, I see that we started to legalize the financial instrument for natural resource management. For example, we started to apply the green credit or green bonds in the region, and for the established natural work of education policy. In the education policy, very limited in the region that in the higher education, I observed many years ago, we already incorporate the environmental economics in the undergraduate curriculum, or FC network is an example of capacity building in the region, but we need to have more in the future, in the policy futures. Thank you very much. I finished my discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Pham.
Yeah.
Our next discussant is the Executive Vice President of the Natural Resources Development Corporation of the Philippines. And he was actually former Deputy Minister or Undersecretary of our Department of Environment and Natural Resources. He also was former chairperson of the ASEAN Senior Officials on the Environment, or ASEAN. So let's welcome Mr. Demetrio Ignacio Jr.
Thank you very much, Shell. First of all, let me congratulate Professor Dasgupta, Ms. Mackenzie, Mr. Parham, the United Kingdom, for an insightful study on two important aspects of our lives, economics and biodiversity. Indeed, traditional economic measurements do not capture the real world. They do not represent the entire wealth of a country and its people. Professor Dasgupta makes a compelling case on how we affect nature, backed up with quantitative evidence. COVID-19, on the other hand, is teaching us to take better care of our biodiversity. Government decisions do create externalities. Government actions do wittingly or unwittingly lead to perverse incentives. In a situation of limited resources and scarcities, especially for poor and developing countries, government faces increasingly complex choices, trade-offs among competing needs in the economy, trade-offs between present and the future. Poor people are preoccupied with their day-to-day survival. The environment, nature, and biodiversity therefore become distant considerations. It is enlightening, however, that metrics have emerged that will guide government and decision makers on their effects on natural wealth. Being aware being able to understand and appreciate can eventually lead to actions on the need to protect and enhance the natural wealth. At the local level, especially in the rural areas where people are closer to nature, it is important that they know and they feel how they affect nature and how nature affects them. For people to have an affirmative outlook of biodiversity, it should concretely contribute to their day-to-day economic needs. Only then can we create a strong local constituencies for biodiversity. The Dasgupta review recognizes that it is the citizens that can bring about change. I believe that the economic of biodiversity can play an important role in fueling this change. The Dasgupta review is an influential literature. It is a building block for understanding economics and biodiversity. I just wish that there will be simpler and more condensed version for the ordinary people. If this is not asking too much of Professor Dasgupta or the United Kingdom. I actually believe that this can be a standard reading material in schools. Hopefully, this can produce even better economies in the future. The Gupta review mentioned the importance of institutions as the overarching entities. It will be instructive if we will be able to expound on the role played by religious institutions. About 60% of all people in the world belongs to the top three religions. Respect for the environment, for plants and animals is a common thread that runs across religions. Religion also has pervasive influence on the behavior and decisions of individuals. Religious institutions can be significant allies in our quest for a better biosphere. Finally, economics is based on rational behavior. Rational behavior before is maybe irrational behavior now. I hope that the Dasgupta review can contribute to a redefinition of rationality in economics. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Indeed, there's, like I said earlier, there's a lot of rethinking that has to be done in my field of economics, including some very fundamental definitions. So thank you for that, Matt and Sir Ignacio. Our next discussant is a member of the 18th Congress of the Philippines, representing the 2nd Congressional District of the province of Albay. He has been a board member of the Green Climate Fund, or GCF, the finance arm of the UN Framework on Climate Change Convention, and actually served as its co-chairperson in 2013, the first Asian to actually chair that GCF. So let's now welcome my good friend, Congressman, the Honorable Jose Sarte, or Joey Salceda.
Thank you very much, Shell. Thank you for the opportunity to share my thoughts on this groundbreaking report. The Philippines is one of the most biodiverse countries in the planet. Our seas are home to some of the densest biomes anywhere in the world. The Dasgupta review asserts that natural capital, like produced and human capital, should be viewed as an economic asset. It argues that the global economy is dependent on and embedded in nature as a resource base. The demands on nature then should not exceed nature's ability to meet these demands or the demands of future generation. In my career as a policymaker, I've been the champion of the practice of virtually internalizing in business the cost to nature and society. The original sin of economics towards nature was to label cost to the environment and to society as externalities, when these costs should have been proportionally priced into the cost of doing business and economic development. That is why in the past 5-6 years, I have played a key role as chairman of the Committee on Ways and Means in practically every current excise tax rates in our laws. While the rates are of course subject to political compromise, we have built a national consensus around the principle of taxing anything legal but still causes nature and society and harm to society. For 9 years prior to my current stint, I was also governor of one of the largest renewable energy producing provinces in the country. Our province has not gained anything for producing clean energy in the country, as should we be getting, because there's no existing national mechanism of cap and trade. The Dasgupta report is an important contribution because it strengthens the case for internalizing the environmental costs of development or the returns to it. I would like to share some caveats though. First, we must be clear that the onus of bearing costs to nature should be on those who do the most damage to nature. And this was most clear to me when I was co-chair of the second co-chair of the Green Climate Fund, one of the key financing mechanisms of the UNFCCC. Almost 80% of historical global emissions have come from developed countries. The pressure first and foremost should be on them. They can move the needle the most, and they have already benefited from the extraction and the disruption of nature. In my term as chairman of the Green Climate Fund, we raised about only 13 billion after the so-called promised 100 billion in order to restore some natural equilibrium to nature, that in order to prevent further move of our planet towards the much feared point of no return in climate change. Second, earnest accounting of cost to nature will involve a change in macroeconomic goals. Output, as measured in GDP, does not account for the destruction of natural asset base. In fact, it rewards it. It only accounts for the mobilization and extraction of nature, which of course incentivizes the rapid exploitation of nature. There must be some way to measure nature as intergenerational wealth that can be exhausted or destroyed if overexploited. Third, we must avoid romanticizing nature even if we try to preserve as much of it as we can. Human civilization is built on manipulation of what is natural. The planet itself, without human intervention, is changing nature in every moment, often violently. Our very own Philippine Island are just a product of violent changes in nature millions of years ago. There's no such thing as a static or pristine nature as we know it. We must therefore think of nature as itself as a dynamic force, along with human civilization and human knowledge, culture, and economy. The merit of the Dasgupta review is that it does allow for a system of extraction from nature, but only at the rate that nature can replace or regenerate. This is an attractive principle, although I'm very sure there will be heated international debate, just like what we have in the United Nations framework for climate change, where I have been involved for almost 13 years. Finally, we should conceive of a global system for preserving biodiversity without kicking the proverbial ladder for developing countries. Applying the cap-and-trade principle outside emissions is a potential solution. New technologies to create economic output in nature-efficient ways should not be withheld from developing countries. An international system of reparations for the use and abuse of biodiversity should also be discussed. I've long fought and was, of course, opposed by developed countries for the loss and damage principles or provisions that should have been in, for example, the Paris Agreement. With COVID-19 severely disrupting economies like the Philippines, the need for global solidarity is more important than ever because extractive options are often cheaper than global crises. And there is always, of course, the right to affordable energy that is embedded in the Paris Agreement, than more sustainable sources of energy and material. I expect a global relapse back to fossil fuels and extractives unless we help each other and share sustainable technologies. Countries like the United Kingdom are global centers for developing such technologies. More than your words, we will need your help. I thank you for the chance to share my thoughts on the review and on the wider discussion of ecologically sustainable economic development across generations. Thank you very much. And I don't know, good afternoon, good day, good night.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Congressman Joey. Our final discussant is an international expert that led the development of the ASEAN Natural Capital Status Report under the Enhanced Regional EU-ASEAN Dialogue instrument, also known as E-READ. He is the chief economist of the International Institute for Environment and Development, or IIED, where he focuses on financing for the UN Sustainable Development Goals and incentives for an inclusive green economy. Let's welcome Mr. Paul Steele. Paul?
Hi, thank you, Dr. Habito, and thanks to ACB for inviting myself and eReady to present in this important webinar. As Dr. Habito explained, I'm going to present the Natural Capital Status Review. I think there should be some slides coming up from ACB that I sent to them earlier. This review was also referred to by the Deputy Secretary General of ASEAN, his remarks. And it has a strong overlap with the recommendations of the Dasgupta review, as it was co-authored by 3 environmental economists who were very much influenced by the kind of thinking that Professor Dasgupta has picked up on. So the review is called Investing in Sustainable Natural Capital in ASEAN. Next slide, please. And basically, we pick up on this point that the Dasgupta review highlights, and other speakers have talked about, the importance of natural capital and the importance particularly of natural capital's contribution to ASEAN. Natural capital produces many benefits to the people and economies of ASEAN and is the foundation to ensure inclusive and sustainable development in ASEAN. As we've heard from the review team, Emily and her colleague, natural capital commonly refers to the stock of natural resources and ecosystems. And as we heard from the director of ACB, ASEAN is one of the most biologically and culturally diverse regions on the planet. The other point that is important to bear in mind is that ASEAN's rich environmental management traditions sustained its people for centuries, and the environment and natural resources is core to the belief systems of many ASEAN peoples. And there has been some important progress in terms of how ASEAN treats its natural capital. But despite some of this progress, there are still some areas for improvements, particularly coordinated action across sectors and investment in natural capital and biodiversity conservation. And that's why the ASEAN, with the support from the European Union, has set out the need for a natural capital roadmap and platform for ASEAN. Next slide, please. So these are the key recommendations of this natural capital status review on sustainable natural capital. First of all, and I think one or two of the other speakers referred to this, to recognize the rights of local people and communities to natural capital and the value of sustainable natural capital in promoting the health and livelihoods of ASEAN's people and their pursuit of the sustainable development goals and economic development. So we need to remember that it's the local people who depend most on the natural capital, and it's their rights that need to be recognized. And we see this in many ASEAN countries, such as the Philippines, which have strong provisions for local resource rights. The second recommendation is to increase dialogue on sustainable natural capital with key stakeholders and actors beyond the environment sector. So this is in particular trying to bring in the ministries of finance of the ASEAN member states to engage in a dialogue around natural capital. I mean, one of the strengths of the Dasgupta review is it was commissioned by the UK's Treasury or Ministry of Finance So we need similar processes in the ASEAN member states, where ministries of finance of the ASEAN countries are engaged on a dialogue around natural capital. So it's not just the Ministry of Environment and Natural Resources, but it also brings in ministries of finance, which often tend to be the more powerful and economically influential ministries. Thirdly, and we've heard from several speakers about this, to enhance knowledge sharing on natural capital accounting and planning and decision-making processes. And we stress the importance of decision-making processes because sometimes natural capital accounting become a big, complicated, expensive exercise, but it doesn't actually lead to any changes in decision-making. So we need to make sure that the numbers that the natural capital accounts, the kind of processes like waves of the World Bank that some speakers have referred to, actually are used by the ministries of finance, by the statistics departments, and by line ministries to actually change their decisions. Then we look at some of the links with business, because it's business and trade which is driving development and economic growth in the ASEAN region. And ASEAN member states, in preparing this natural capital status review, were very keen that it should be linked to the economic drivers in the private sector. So we call for common standards and effective compliance on business practices to promote sustainable natural capital. Another area which is very important is that there are a number of perverse incentives or subsidies which undermine sustainable natural capital. Things like incentives for land clearance, such as palm oil, fishery subsidies for overuse of fisheries and extraction of minerals into remote forestry areas. So all these policies and incentives need to be gradually reformed and adapted to continuously improve them for sustainable natural capital. Then we need to promote enabling conditions and an environment for businesses to invest in sustainable natural capital, the kind of areas such as organic agriculture and ecotourism once the COVID pandemic hopefully ends and tourism picks up again in the ASEAN region. And these can be investment areas for growth in sustainable natural capital. Then to strengthen agencies in charge of natural capital, the agencies responsible for water, coasts, land and wildlife and other natural capital resources, which tend to be starved of finance and generally a bit politically marginalized in government. So they need to be strengthened and properly funded in government so that they can carry out their enforcement conditions. And finally, and as I've said already, to mainstream sustainable natural capital practices into ASEAN business and investment decision making. So those are the key recommendations. Next slide, please. Then we come up with this roadmap where we have certain programs for how to take forward these recommendations. We have recommend a program on a healthy environment and a healthy ASEAN, and this links to the link between the destruction of ecosystems and pandemics such as COVID emerging from mismanagement of ecosystems. Then, as we heard from the UK ambassador to ASEAN, the importance of inclusive nature-based solutions and ASEAN climate resilience. Then ASEAN sustainable forestry, including environmental safeguards, sustainable oceans for ASEAN, ASEAN rivers management, and then greening the ASEAN finance markets and private sector. So the private financial decisions also include biodiversity when they're making their investment decisions. And then an important area is pro-poor conservation, so that poor people actually benefit from the many protected areas that ACB and others have helped declare in the ASEAN region. And finally, we have some recommendations for how natural capital can be picked up in COVID. We heard from Professor Dasgupta about the importance of the post-COVID green recovery, and we also apply these to the ASEAN region in areas such as food security, alternative employment, prevention of illegal wildlife trade, climate resilience, and cross-sectoral coordination. Next slide, please, and this is my final slide. So the ASEAN Natural Capital Roadmap and Platform. The roadmap will be prepared based on the key recommendations and the elements from these findings and discussed further among ASEAN member states. And then the proposal is with, hopefully with EU funding support and other support from other ASEAN partners to develop an ASEAN natural capital platform, which would serve as a multi-sectoral and multi-stakeholder coordination mechanism that facilitates future regional activities on natural capital driven by relevant government, private sector and ASEAN stakeholders, and would implement the natural capital roadmap. So thank you very much, and I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Paul, for that. And so now we have a little time for the open Q&A, and with everybody's indulgence, I hope everybody's okay to move on, to extend to 5 o'clock. We had intended originally to end by 4:45, but since our Q&A has been somewhat crowded out, I'd like to take a little more time, and so we will do that extension. So without further ado, let me try and get into the questions. And one question with a comment that actually came in as part of the registration comes from my friend, Dr. Corazon Claudio, who along with the attorney Maripas or Ipat Luna has actually shared the information that in the Philippine Congress, very recently, there has been filed a bill that will establish the Philippine Ecosystem and Natural Capital Accounting System, or PENCAS, as the acronym suggests, which is actually an initiative of a wide network of sustainable development advocates, to which I proudly belong, along with Dr. Claudio. But her questions really boil down to this. And I guess this question is addressed to anybody who may care to actually reply. What top 3 actions can and should this business sector do to hasten the transitions beyond the finance and education systems that are only partly under their control? And by the way, I might as well also post a question specifically directed by Cora to Congressman Salceda. May we have your support for the PENCAS bill that has just been filed by Deputy Speaker Lauren Legarda? So may we get somebody, perhaps our members from the Dasgupta team, if you care, or other members of the panel. What are the top 3 actions that can and should be done by the business sector to hasten those transitions that are actually being suggested?
Sure, yeah, I can have a first go, and can come in if he wants to add something. I think one of the things the Dasgupta review recognizes that the systems within which businesses operate and the demand that's driving those systems are really important. So there is also an emphasis on the importance of policy for shaping the incentives that business face, and for all of us as consumers who demand things from business to move to more sustainable consumption choices. So I'm not taking the onus off business, but just that the policy and consumer decisions are also a big emphasis in the review. But for in terms of what businesses themselves can do, I think we emphasize 3 things in particular. One of them is around technological innovations. So although the review shows that technology itself is not a panacea, it won't solve all the problems, but there are many technologies out there, for example, in food systems, things like precision agriculture, vertical farming, genetically modified crops, meat analogs. All of these can reduce, for food production, the contribution to land use change and climate change. So there's a whole raft of sustainable technologies. The other is the second is importance of accounting for businesses' impact and dependence on nature along entire supply chains. I mentioned that briefly, but just having this transparency, information from each stage on those impacts. This can be done using geospatial data, then verifying them using technologies like blockchain, and then holding actors across supply chains to account. I think is all going to be important. But Ant, I don't know if Ant wants to add anything further from the team.
Yes, anyone else care to add to that? Again, the question was the top 3 actions perhaps that business can undertake to help along what the Dasgupta review has talked about. Anyone? Okay, otherwise I'll go on to the next one. I'm looking at the Q&A box, and Leonie Pearson from the Stockholm Environment Institute had posed this question. This is specifically directed to Emily McKenzie. The inclusive wealth approach could also be used to account for progress towards much of the SDGs, which ASEAN, in fact, has agreed to deliver. Has this measurement approach been adopted in other countries?
Yes, so if I understand the question right about the inclusive wealth approach, yeah, we have a few case studies that move towards an inclusive wealth approach. I think the review has quite a broad umbrella of what is making progress along these fronts. For example, we have a case study on the New Zealand's living standards framework, which looks at measures of natural capital and wealth, but also indicators of well-being. And I think impressively, they've been using that in their budgeting process in the New Zealand Treasury. So we have a case study on that. We also look at work in China to measure gross ecosystem product as a complement to GDP, just looking at the flow of ecosystem services and how those change at local, provincial scales, and using that in holding local decision makers to account. So those are two examples. Obviously, I'm sure many people are aware in March of this year, the UN System of Environmental and Economic Accounting formalized their ecosystem accounts and the valuation involved as a set of principles. And there is much work, I know, familiar with some of the work in the Philippines, probably many other countries are making progress along those lines, but there's still much to be done. So I guess we see that as a really important milestone since the review was published in providing a UN statistical standard and set of sort of internationally authorized principles for the ecosystem accounts.
Thank you. Well, I don't know who can really answer this next question, coming from Dr. Ben Malayang, also a former Undersecretary at the Department of Environment and Natural Resources in the Philippines. He says, expectedly, governments will continue to focus their development investments on converting natural capital to politically valuable goods and services. So is there some likelihood that bilateral and multilateral development financing institutions would focus, or at least offer larger portfolios on natural capital restoration and accumulation? I don't know who can speak for the bilateral and the multilateral financing institutions here, or if somebody in the audience, in fact, may want to chime in on that, do let us know. But from your perspective, Emily, and again, our other resource persons, can anybody sort of hazard some kind of a projection as far as behavior of our multilaterals and bilaterals are concerned? Anyone? Or perhaps from Congressman Salceda, who used to be part of the, at least the global financing mechanism. No one? Okay, we'll park that question for a while. Let me read one from our Facebook platform. This one comes, and this is again addressed to the Dasgupta team. This is coming from Ramesh Bunratana from Mahidol University in Thailand. Did the review consider stochastic variables, both natural and anthropogenic variables?
I'm not sure I entirely understand the question.
Well, stochastic variables, again, have to do with the very variable, yeah, but very unpredictable or highly variable.
Is it asking in the context of, in what context do we think this is in it?
Yeah, it's Ramesh Gunratana. Can you unmute?
I think it was a question from the Facebook Live.
Oh, that's right. I'm sorry. Yeah, it was a Facebook question. So I guess we probably have to try and answer that in writing via Facebook.
Yeah, I'll be happy to follow up with the person individually if they're talking about the economic growth and development model within the review. Just to, yeah, we can get into the technical details separately.
Sure, yeah, it's somewhat technical as well. But anyway, let me move on. Going down the line again, we have from Jan Lloyd Balon or Balon. Sorry, I have to get rid of this call. Here we go. Mr. Balon is from the Mount Iglit Bako Natural Park. Does the Dasgupta review provide for the specific models for sustainable financing for protected areas? And if yes, how will these models incorporate indigenous/anthropological practices?
Yes, so I guess on sustainable finance, the review has two chapters. One looks at redirecting financial flows as a sort of enabling asset in natural capital. And so there we do look at sustainable financing for conservation and for restoration, including for protected areas. There's just as a complement to that, there's another chapter which looks at management of financial risks and the role of the financial institutions in looking at what the financial risks are that are emerging from our loss of nature. There isn't a huge amount of detail on the specific models for finance for protected areas, but there is in a complementary chapter look at community-based natural resource management, as I sort of mentioned in my presentation, and the importance and the evidence of the importance of local and indigenous knowledge in making all of these institutions work well at local level, including protected areas. But I think your question is getting at quite an interesting angle about sustainable finance in particular. It's where conservation is linking up to sustainable finance and the role of indigenous communities. So I don't think we get into a lot of detail, but certainly recognize the evidence that those indigenous models, first of all, indigenous communities manage a huge proportion of what's left, and that there is strong evidence that they are some of the most effective managers.
Thank you. Let me move on to a question from Jose Padilla. First, he says, thank you for the informative presentation. And that graph showing the time series values of produced capital, human capital, and natural assets sends many messages. One is that the growth in produced capital could have been made possible through the conversion of natural capital. The graph visually indicates a high ratio that is untenable. If this observation is supported by evidence and in the context of trade-offs, it seems to me, he says, that humanity needs to improve on the efficiency in the use of natural capital and to increase that stock upon which produced capital depends. This would mean that as we continue to increase the level of produced capital, the demand on natural assets should proportionately be less, again, due to technological advances perhaps and sustainable consumption. And of course, further investments in natural capital. All of these could possibly reverse that trend. So he's wondering how the recommendations from the Dasgupta review would impact on the trajectories of those lines representing the three, especially produced capital and natural capital. If there's a balance that we should aim for example.
Yeah, so I'm not sure we give a sort of specific, we don't give specific goals or predictions in the review. We don't do analysis to sort of say what the overall goals will be, but obviously they'll be the subject of a very important conference of parties for the CPD COP15 later this year. I think what we do say in the review is that that trajectory of our natural assets going down needs needs to increase, and that it needs to increase. We need to stop the downward track. We need to increase it above our current level. So not only stop it going down, but restore ourselves. And that's based on the manifestation of these risks that we're already starting to see with local ecosystem tipping points. COVID-19, I think some of the early speakers mentioned as a signal that the pressures we're putting on are already producing major risks to our economies. So we need to not only conserve what we have, but restore to a greater level. And I think that there are many who have been arguing for these 30% targets on natural assets. We don't say that's exactly what it should be, but we give a lot of the scientific evidence that's behind those goals for both marine and terrestrial systems. What the question asks about produced capital and getting more efficient in the use of that is really interesting. I'm not sure we say much specific about that, but it would be great to think about it further, and I'll raise it with Professor Dasgupta, who I'm sure would have a great answer.
Yeah, in fact, that question reminds me of a graph I saw years ago, about 10 years ago, I guess, which showed that in OECD countries, meaning the richer countries, the GDP growth graph has been diverging and of course rising faster than the graph of natural resource use. But in the more developing countries and the poorer countries, there's still that too close correlation between GDP growth and natural resource use. So I guess that last point of Mr. Padilla was that there should be that decoupling between GDP growth and natural resource use, and meaning much more efficient production, but not necessarily too much based on natural resource depletion.
Definitely. And so, that makes a lot of sense. And one of the things we emphasize in the review is the link between this extraction of provisioning services, as they're called in the jargon, timber, food, minerals, and so on, is putting huge pressure on what gets called in the terminology, these regulating services that all of our economic activity and livelihoods and well-being depend on. The nutrient cycling, the climate regulation, disease control, but because those aren't priced, we're ignoring them. So that tension, and that's what's really driving the need for exactly what our questioner is asking, to be more efficient in that extraction.
Well, here's one from Ambassador Juniver Mahilum West, and this is addressed to any of the speakers. The interlinkages between and among biodiversity, climate change, and environmental protection are very much on the international agenda in COVID-19 recovery frameworks, especially in the run-up to Kunming and Glasgow. There is much discussion of the need for sustainable recovery by building back better, by embracing the principles of the green economy and the circular economy. Some developing countries, however, view this path to recovery as too expensive for their limited resources and insist that the most urgent goal in recovery is first and foremost survival. So what are the most persuasive arguments to demonstrate that inputting nature, environment, and biodiversity conservation early on in development plans is the way to go? Anyone among the group, not necessarily just Emily? Indeed, this is a challenge right now everybody's plotting the post-COVID recovery framework, and obviously survival and immediate recovery is top of mind, to the point of sacrificing perhaps some of the sustainability concerns.
Dr. Vito, I can have a go at that if you want.
Yes, please. Yeah. Welcome.
Yeah, I mean, in the initial emergency stage, obviously the priority is health and the vaccine and PPE and so on. But as we come out of the initial emergency into the recovery and the economic recovery in particular, the evidence suggests that green kind of biodiversity friendly job investments are in fact the best way to generate jobs. So if you look at jobs in terms of renewable energy, or if you look at jobs in terms of natural restoration schemes, both of them have a very high amount of jobs connected with them, and can be quite important for economic recovery. So you can integrate your biodiversity investments into your economic recovery.
Well, thank you for that, Paul. I'm afraid we may have to wind up. There are a few other questions that we will have to just perhaps try and address directly with those who asked the questions, because our time is indeed up already at this point. And so I would like at this point to, again, extend our gratitude to our panelists and of course our presenters from the Dasgupta Review. And well, in fact, being at the end of our session, I'd just like to call again on the resource economics specialist of the B Camp project. This is none other than Dr. Marianne de Los Angeles, or Anne as we call her. She is from the consultancy think tank Niras Finland Oy. Let me give the floor to her, for she will be giving us a synthesis for today. Dr. Anne?
Thank you, Dr. Habito Shell. Let me move my PowerPoint first to this screen. I guess you see it already.
Not the full screen, Doc.
We're seeing half of the screen.
Okay.
Can you try unsharing and sharing again?
How about this one? Still not?
We're just seeing the right half of the screen.
Okay. Now I see what's happening. Sorry, I was working on it while we were having the discussion, so I accidentally closed it, and now I have to open it again.
Go ahead.
What's important to note is that the discussion is very rich, and that many questions are research questions that will have to be pursued as the various institutions here, including ACB, prioritize their future work. Do you see it now?
There we go.
Okay, thank you. So I tried to structure the discussion according to the key messages. But before I go through some of the details of the key messages from the Dasgupta team, as well as the panelists, I'd like to emphasize that the guest speakers and our executive director were in unison about the importance of ASEAN natural capital and natural capital accounting and the threats to nature. The ambassador particularly looks forward to upcoming global events, including post-2019 biodiversity framework, to be informed by the Dasgupta Review. He also emphasized that the engagement of the UK in ASEAN, examining disaster risk, the Dasgupta report, what can be learned from it and how it can be applied in ASEAN and its ASEAN member countries. The most important big words that are in my mind are that he said that we should think big, particularly with respect to recovery post-COVID, that green investments are necessary that are to scale, not small investments, and that they should be complementary in order for such investments to increase productivity, generate employment opportunities, and increase inclusive wealth. The framework of the review are that we are asset managers, but among the assets, natural capital has declined considerably, produced capital increased considerably, and human capital increased somewhat. Nature is an asset, and of which the biodiversity characteristic is unique and very much key to continued existence, enables portfolio diversification. You will note that in every slide I have embedded the Q&A. So in this one, there is no particular Q&A. Again, the messages, key messages that the economy is embedded in nature, not outside of it. But prosperity as measured by GDP is achieved at the expense of nature, indicated by the Global Living Planet Index. Now comes the meat or basis of the first set of recommendations or future directions, and that is what Emily Mackenzie expanded on, the ecological footprint as being greater than the regeneration of the biosphere, and the components of the ecological footprints are enumerated here in the equation. And the major recommendation is to balance the equation, where for the moment demand, and that is to strive for demand to decline or to prevent further increase in the future, and for supply to increase through conservation investments. Dr. Nam, on the decrease of demand, Dr. Nam Pan presented his considerable analysis of research in IPSI so far and policy applications, and charted future directions for this large network to look into for its future work. And this is really quite important reflection. Yusef Ignacio did mention that, and after appreciating the contributions of the DR, that there are many trade-offs that are important to assess, particularly in the context of poor nations. And this was also reiterated in two other comments. There was a question by Dr. Padilla, for example, about produced capital and natural capital trajectories, which is probably a research question on scenarios. And the other point that is similar to this comment has to do with the input from Ambassador Mahilam West about the interlinkages and the upcoming discussion in Kunming and Glasgow with respect to COVID-19 recovery, nature-based investments and the like, building back better, and the other principles of the green economy and circular economy. He emphasized that the path to recovery might be too expensive and that the resources are limited. This is a challenge to the global financial network or system. As important are characteristics that were emphasized in the review as expanded by the team, that the nature's properties, particularly mobility, silence, and invisible, set ourselves up to institutional failure. That markets are incomplete and some aspects are missing, and they do not account for externalities. Ergo, ecosystem services, including provisional services, are undervalued and unpriced. IPSI does have considerable work on evaluation, and the applications need to be extended further to this more decision-making context. The second important finding on the use of better metrics for economic success, i.e. inclusive wealth measurement, and that is natural capital accounting to improve decision-making. There were two questions from John Balon on the Mount Iglit Bako Natural Park, and from Hubert Kiblat on the mining industry. And these are actually research questions. The empirics will have to be worked out by ecologists and economists collaborating among themselves, among others. Still on better metrics for economic success, Dr. Nam Pan mentioned the current efforts at the national level of Indonesia and the Philippines, and future directions are being charted out in these countries. For the other countries, the implementation of SEA and the SEA ecosystem services accounting laws are needed to compel the statistical institutions to include this in their work, and for them to collaborate with others in improving the statistical systems as well. Paul Steele did mention the applications of the wealth accounting and valuation of ecosystem services in the Philippines, and the work of WAVES in other parts of the world have also improved planning, finance, and other institutional decision making. There's a need for enabling conditions for investments in sustainable natural capital and strengthening agencies in charge of natural capital. And all these are actually related with each other. Considerable discussion on transforming institutions, especially financial and educational systems. It's notable that the report mentions Southeast Asia examples of community-based work, action on the ground. Also, Dr. Nam, from this, opines that the IPSU network that he heads needs to deepen its work and expand the number of people engaged in environmental and ecological economics work. There are two comments about cost internalization and trade-offs, or three, I think. One brought about by Yusef Ignacio on the role played by the poor. This was in another comment. He also emphasized that the institutions, other institutions like the religious institutions are important, and he appreciates the need for rethinking rational behavior. Congressman Salceda, an economist, appreciates the review strengthening of the need for cost internalization by various stakeholders and new measures of economic growth. He offers several caveats on this, and that is that one should pay attention, especially on those who did most damage, that their effort to have high capital available from the Global Climate Fund is still an aspiration. During his time, the capitalization was still quite low versus the target. He also cautions against avoiding romanticizing nature and anticipates that there would still be heated international debate on resource extraction and the need to look more closely into the international system for biodiversity loss and damage principles, not yet in the Paris Agreement. This is quite a healthy debate in here too in the international community. Paul mentioned the National Capital Platform, the need to increase dialogue and knowledge sharing among various stakeholders. Eventually also mainstream sustainable practices into business and environment. He mentioned various elements of a future natural capital roadmap, which should hopefully already will help facilitate for ASEAN. And these are the elements that he mentioned. Considerable suggestions were also opined. Dr. Cora Claudio of the Management Association of Philippines informed us about the PENCAS bill and the need for additional support. Invited the panel to contribute to the ebook, proposed ebook. And then the actions of the business sector to hasten institutional transition. Some of these were suggested by Emily, but this is still food for thought for many of us. Similarly, the need for for bilateral and multilateral institutions, particularly development financing institutions focus also needs to shift. So this is another comment that I culled from the Q&A, but which did not get discussed. So I think this is not the only one. There are many others. I apologize for not having enough speed to catch up with the very intensive and complicated discussions. We will continue working on these notes. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ann, for that very comprehensive synthesis of today's discussion. I'm sure organizers will get back to those questions which we were not able to respond to today. And of course, to Dr. Shell Habito, thank you very much for your excellent moderation of today's webinar. And to all our distinguished speakers and panelists, our sincere thanks to your participation. We hope you can answer a brief evaluation of this webinar. We have provided the link of this evaluation and posted it in the Zoom chat box and in the comment section of the Facebook live stream. As indicated in our earlier announcements, this is a webinar series on the economics of ecosystems and biodiversity. And please follow the ACB social media accounts for announcements on upcoming events, such as the next part of this webinar series, which will happen next month. You can find us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues and partners, that concludes our virtual session for today. On behalf of the entire team of the ASEAN Center for Biodiversity, thank you and have a wonderful evening. Bye-bye.